The old hospital loomed against the black sky, its silhouette jagged and broken like a skeletal hand clutching at the stars. For decades, St. Grimwald's had been whispered about in hushed tones, the kind of place you only mentioned in ghost stories. But for Clara, a newly certified nurse, it was just her unlucky assignment. Night shift on her first week. It wasn't glamorous, but she needed the money, and beggars couldn't be choosers. The lobby smelled of bleach and something older, damp, maybe, or the ghosts of forgotten patients. Clara glanced at the security guard stationed near the reception desk, his face pale and drawn under the flickering fluorescent lights. His name tag read Omar. He didn't look up from his crossword puzzle, but his hand twitched when she passed him as if to wave her back. First night, he muttered without raising his head. Yeah, any advice? He hesitated. Then, after a glance around the empty lobby, leaned closer. Keep to the main halls, and if you hear anything strange, don't check it out. Just stay at your station. Strange, like what? She asked, but he was already retreating to his crossword, his silence more unsettling than his words. The elevator groaned as it carried Clara to the 5th floor. The staff had jokingly referred to it as the Ghost Wing. Budget cuts had left most of it unused, its far ends sealed off with yellowing caution tape. A single hallway remained operational, lined with dimly lit patient rooms. Clara's station was at the far end of this hall, a cramped desk with a buzzing desk lamp and an old computer that took 5 minutes to boot up. Her shift started quietly enough. She checked the charts, visited the 3 patients still residing on the floor. An elderly man recovering from hip surgery, a woman with pneumonia, and a comatose teenager whose accident had been the talk of the town. The comatose boy, Ethan, unnerved her the most. His eyes didn't quite close all the way, and his breathing was so shallow that more than once she had to lean close to confirm he was alive. By 2 a.m., boredom set in. The hum of the fluorescent lights mixed with the ticking of the ancient clock above her desk. She sipped lukewarm coffee, scrolling through the news on her phone when she heard it, a faint shuffle like slippers dragging across the floor. She froze, ears straining. The patients were either bedridden or too weak to move unaided. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of Ethan's room. Heart pounding, Clara grabbed her flashlight and crept toward the source. The hallway felt unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Clara paused outside Ethan's room. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as if recently disturbed. She pushed it open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Ethan was still in bed, his body as motionless as ever. But the chair beside him, the one she distinctly remembered leaving, pushed against the wall, was now facing his bed, as though someone had been sitting there, watching him. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest. She backed out of the room, her footsteps quick and clumsy. At her desk, she reached for the phone to call security, but stopped when she saw the monitor. The feed from the hallway cameras was staticky, the images twisting in and out of focus. Amid the distortion, she caught glimpses of movement. A figure, too pale and too tall, darting between the shadows. Clara's breath hitched. "Omar," she said aloud, hoping he'd hear her through the intercom. No response. The shuffling started again, this time from the opposite end of the hall. Clara turned, her flashlight catching glimpses of peeling wallpaper and empty gurneys. Her own reflection stared back at her from a dark window, eyes wide with terror. Except, the reflection wasn't quite right. It blinked when she didn't. Her scream caught in her throat as the glass warped, the reflection reaching toward her, its mouth opening impossibly wide. She stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. When she picked it up, the reflection was gone, but the faint outline of a handprint lingered on the glass as though something had pressed against the other side. The intercom crackled and Omar's voice broke the silence. "Clara, are you there?" "Yes," she gasped, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong up here." "I know," he said, his tone grim. "You need to get out." Now, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, Clara saw them. Figures, translucent and hollow-eyed, lining the hallway. Their mouths moved silently, but the message was clear. Leave. She bolted for the elevator, slamming the button repeatedly. The doors creaked open, and she stepped inside, only to feel a cold hand brush her shoulder. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The ride down felt endless, the elevator jerking and groaning as though resisting her escape. When the doors finally opened, she sprinted into the lobby, Omar was waiting, his face pale and drawn. "What the hell is going on?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking. He hesitated, then said, "They say the ghost wing isn't just abandoned, it's angry. The hospital shut it down after incidents. Patients who went missing, staff who never came back. They're still there, Clara, and they don't like being disturbed." Clara didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her bag and ran into the night, vowing never to return to St. Grimwald's. But as she reached her car, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from the hospital system, one she hadn't sent. "Night shift logged. Welcome back, Clara." Her reflection in the car window smirked.
Story number 2.
The gas station sat on the edge of nowhere, a single flickering light in an ocean of darkness. Its pale green sign hummed faintly against the pressing black, the letters half burned out, so it read GSSOP instead of gas stop. Beneath it, Jace leaned on the counter, idly flipping through a magazine that had been outdated for months. Night shifts were always dead. Literally no one drove through this desolate stretch of road after midnight unless they were hopelessly lost or running from something. And yet, Jace's boss insisted the station stay open 24/7. "Just in case," the old man always muttered, though he never explained what case they were preparing for. The radio hissed static from behind the counter, filling the quiet with a low, buzzing hum. Every so often, Jace swore he heard voices in the static. Faint, overlapping whispers that were too soft to make out, but just loud enough to unsettle him. He chalked it up to the crappy equipment and ignored it. It was just after 2 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled. Jace sat up straighter, startled. He hadn't heard a car pull up. The man who entered looked normal enough at first glance. Tall, gaunt, dressed in a black coat that seemed too heavy for the warm night. But there was something off about him, something Jace couldn't put his finger on. Maybe it was the way the man didn't seem to blink, or the way he moved too fluidly, like a shadow made flesh. "Evening," Jace said, his voice catching slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the back of the store, his movements soundless despite the scuffed linoleum floor. He lingered in the snack aisle, his pale hand brushing over the shelves without picking anything up. Jace cleared his throat. "Need help finding something?" The man turned slowly, his head tilting to one side like a curious bird. His face was blank, emotionless, but his eyes, they were wrong. Black. Not just dark, but completely, impossibly black, as though his eye sockets were holes into some lightless void. Jace's stomach flipped. He gripped the edge of the counter, his palms slick with sweat. The man smiled then, a slow, deliberate stretch of his lips that revealed teeth too sharp to belong to any human. "Where is she?" the man asked. "Who?" Jace stammered, his mind racing. The man stepped closer, his movements fluid and predatory. "You don't belong here," he said softly. His voice was strange, layered, as though a dozen people were speaking at once. Jace backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to leave." The man's smile widened, impossibly wide, splitting his face like a wound. "She doesn't belong either." The radio crackled behind Jace, the static rising to a deafening pitch. For a split second, he thought he heard a woman's voice screaming through the noise. He spun around, his eyes darting to the radio, but it looked the same as always. A battered piece of junk spewing static. When he turned back, the man was gone. Jace froze. The store was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that feels like a living thing. He walked around the counter, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the void. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. No response. The bell above the door hadn't jingled. There was no way the man could have left without Jace hearing him. He checked the aisles, the storage room, even the bathroom. Nothing. It was as if the man had evaporated into thin air. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the store, so complete and oppressive that Jace couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he switched on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, landing on the snack aisle. She was standing there. A woman, drenched and shivering, her face pale and drawn. Her clothes clung to her as though she'd just climbed out of a river, water pooling at her feet. Her wide eyes locked onto Jace, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Are you okay?" Jace asked, his voice cracking. She took a step forward, her bare feet splashing in the water that now coated the floor. Jace stumbled back, his light flickering as though the phone was dying. The woman raised a hand, pointing behind him. Jace didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. to get out of the store and never look back, but he couldn't move. Slowly, as though his body were acting against his will, he turned. The man was standing right there, inches away. Black eyes, sharp teeth, that impossible smile. Jace screamed as the man's hand shot out, gripping his throat like a vice. His vision blurred, the edges darkening as the man leaned in close, whispering words that didn't make sense, words that burned into Jace's mind like brands. When Jace woke, he was lying on the floor of the store, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly above him. The clock read 5:37 a.m., and the morning sun was just beginning to seep through the windows. The store was empty, silent except for the hum of the lights. But the floor was still wet, puddles leading from the snack aisle to the counter, and scrawled across the wall in dripping black letters were the words, "She's waiting." Jace quit the night shift that morning, but no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the whispers and the static always found him.
Story number 3.
The hotel had seen better days. It stood at the edge of the city, a crumbling monument to forgotten luxury, its once golden facade tarnished and cracked. Leona checked in reluctantly, her car having broken down on the highway, leaving her no choice but to spend the night in this derelict place. The lobby was vast and eerily silent, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. The concierge, an elderly man with cloudy eyes, handed her a rusted key attached to a weighty brass tag. It read, 606. "Top floor," he said in a voice like dry leaves. "Keep to yourself." Leona frowned but didn't ask questions. She just wanted to sleep and be gone by morning. The elevator rattled as it climbed, each floor ticking by with an ominous groan. When the doors creaked open, the hallway was dim, lit only by weak sconces along the faded wallpaper. Room 606 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. "Great," she muttered, pushing it open. Inside, the room was cold and bare, the furniture worn but serviceable. A single window overlooked the highway, its glass fogged from the inside. She locked the door behind her, dropped her bag on the bed, and collapsed onto the mattress without even pulling the covers back. It was sometime past midnight when the noises began. At first, it was faint, just a soft tapping like someone knocking gently on a door. Leona stirred but didn't open her eyes. She was too tired to care. The tapping grew louder, sharper, and now it was accompanied by a sound like shuffling footsteps. Her eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the single lamp she'd left on now extinguished. She fumbled for her phone, its screen casting a pale glow across the room. The noise was coming from the hallway. Tap, shuffle, tap. She tiptoed to the door, her heart hammering. Pressing her ear to the wood, she strained to listen. The tapping stopped. The hallway was silent, save for the faint hum of the elevator in the distance. She exhaled shakily, convincing herself it was just her imagination, and turned to head back to bed. But the moment she stepped away, there was a sharp knock, this time on her door. "Who's there?" she called, trying to sound braver than she felt. No answer. She peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, stretching into shadow. Her fingers hovered over the lock, debating whether to open the door, but then a faint sound drifted from behind her. A whisper, low and breathy, impossible to make out. She spun around, clutching her phone like a weapon. The room was empty. The only sound, her own ragged breathing. She bolted to the light switch and flicked it on. Nothing happened. The lamp refused to come on, and her phone battery suddenly plummeted to 1%, the screen dimming before it blinked off entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping in a haunting, nonsensical chorus. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. The mirror above the dresser caught her attention. It was fogging over, just like the window, but this time there was writing forming on the glass, written by an invisible hand. "Help me." Leona stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the freezing room. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. She turned slowly toward the window. A figure stood outside. On the 6th floor, its face was pale and featureless, its body pressed against the glass as though gravity didn't apply to it. It raised a hand, and the tapping began again, this time louder, more frantic. She grabbed the room key and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. The whispers crescendoed into an ear-splitting wail, and the mirror shattered behind her. Just as the door swung open, she felt a hand brush the back of her neck, icy and damp. She didn't look back. Sprinting down the hallway, she reached the elevator and slammed the button repeatedly. The doors creaked open and she dove inside, frantically pressing the lobby button. The elevator shuddered, groaning as it descended. The lights flickered, and for a moment, she was plunged into total darkness. When the lights came back on, she wasn't alone. The figure from the window stood in the corner, its head tilting unnaturally as it stared at her with eyeless sockets. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and wrong, its mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. The elevator jolted to a stop, the doors grinding open. Leona didn't hesitate. She bolted through the lobby, past the vacant concierge desk, and out into the night. Her car, miraculously, started on the first try, and she sped away without looking back. She reported the incident to the police the next day. But when they searched the hotel, they found it abandoned, condemned for over a decade. Room 606 didn't exist. It had been bricked over years ago after a string of disappearances. But Leona knew what she'd seen, and every night since, she's woken to the sound of tapping at her bedroom window.
Story number 4.
The rental listing seemed perfect. A quaint little house at the edge of town, dirt cheap and available immediately. Maya was thrilled to move in and leave the chaos of city life behind. The landlord was an older woman with a brittle smile who handed her the keys with a trembling hand. "It's all yours," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, after a long pause, added, "Stay out of the basement." Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't press. It was probably some storage area filled with old junk, and she had no intention of exploring. The house was hers now, and she was ready for a fresh start. The first night was uneventful. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that bordered on eerie, but Maya didn't mind. She unpacked, cooked herself a simple dinner, and curled up on the couch with a book. By midnight, she was fast asleep. The dripping woke her at 3:12 a.m. At first, she thought it was a leaky faucet. She shuffled to the kitchen, bleary-eyed, but the sink was dry. The sound persisted, rhythmic and loud, like water falling into a pool. It seemed to echo through the floorboards, coming from below, the basement. Maya hesitated. The landlord's warning lingered in her mind, but the dripping was incessant, almost accusatory. She grabbed a flashlight and found the basement door at the end of the hallway. It was locked, but the old brass key she'd been given slid into the lock with a reluctant click. The smell hit her first, damp and earthy, like the air after a heavy rain. The stairs creaked as she descended, the flashlight beam bouncing off the concrete walls. At the bottom, she found a small windowless room with a single exposed light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and water. The floor was submerged, the murky liquid rippling slightly as though disturbed by unseen movements. Maya shivered, her breath catching in her throat. At the center of the room was an old rusted clawfoot tub. It was filled to the brim, the water black as ink. The dripping sound was louder now, echoing off the walls, though there was no visible source. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. It was a ridiculous thing to say. No one was here. But as the words left her mouth, the water in the tub began to ripple violently, as though something massive was moving beneath the surface. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering, and then she saw it, a hand, pale and bloated, breaking the surface of the water. It was followed by another, and then a head, hair plastered to a face she couldn't quite make out. The figure pulled itself up slowly, water cascading from its body, pooling at its feet. Its eyes were dark pits, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. Maya's legs gave out, and she fell backward, the flashlight slipping from her hand and rolling away. In the dim, flickering light, she saw the figure lurch toward her, its movements unnatural and jerky, as though it wasn't used to walking. The air grew heavy, and Maya felt as though she was being pulled downward, like the room itself was trying to drown her. She scrambled back up the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would burst. As she reached the top, the door slammed shut on its own, nearly catching her fingers. The dripping stopped. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch with every light in the house on, clutching her phone, but no calls went through, no texts sent. It was as though the house was sealed off from the rest of the world. The next day, she tried to leave, but her car wouldn't start. Even the neighbors, few and far between, didn't answer their doors. She was trapped. That night, the dripping returned. It was louder, more insistent. She locked the basement door, wedging a chair beneath the handle for good measure, but the sound seeped through the walls, invading her every thought. At 3:12 a.m., she heard it again. Water sloshing, footsteps squelching against the floor. This time, they were coming up the stairs. Her bedroom door creaked open, and the air turned icy. She didn't look. She couldn't. She felt the weight of something at the foot of her bed, the mattress sinking slightly as though someone or something had sat down. "Help me," a voice rasped, gurgling and wet. When she finally dared to open her eyes, the figure was inches from her face, its dark, hollow eyes boring into hers. Water poured from its mouth as it repeated, over and over, "Help me. Help me." Maya screamed, throwing herself out of bed and bolting for the front door. She didn't care that it was raining, didn't care that she had no car. She just ran, the icy wetness clinging to her skin as though the figure's touch lingered. She never went back. Weeks later, the landlord called her, furious. "You didn't even clean out your things," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to rent that place out? People don't stay." Maya barely managed to choke out a question. "The basement," she whispered. "What's in the basement?" The landlord hesitated. "That's none of your concern," she said curtly. Then, softer, "Some things are better left alone." The call ended, but Maya couldn't shake the sound of the dripping. Even now, miles away in a new apartment, it followed her, steady and relentless, growing louder every night. She knows it won't stop until she returns.
Story number 5.
Nina always hated the house's antique mirror. It was tall and ornate, framed in blackened wood carved with twisting, grotesque shapes that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. Her grandmother had insisted it stay when Nina inherited the house. "It's been here since the house was built," her grandmother had said, a strange look in her eyes. "Don't move it. Don't cover it." Nina thought it was nonsense. The mirror creeped her out, but she didn't believe in the superstitions her grandmother muttered. Still, she left it where it stood, in the corner of the living room, facing the bay window. It reflected the entire room during the day and cast unsettling shadows at night. Her first week in the house was uneventful. She cleaned, unpacked, and settled in, ignoring the mirror as much as possible. Then, one night, as she passed through the living room, she caught something out of the corner of her eye. A movement. She froze, her heart thudding. Slowly, she turned to the mirror. The room behind her was empty, exactly as it should be, but something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, colder. She stepped closer, peering into the glass. Her reflection stared back, her own face pale and wide-eyed, but there was someone else standing behind her. A man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by shadow, his eyes two glinting points of light. He didn't move. He just stood there, impossibly still, his head tilted slightly as though studying her. Nina spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, he was gone. For hours, she sat on the couch, staring at the mirror, waiting for the man to reappear. He didn't. By morning, she convinced herself it was a trick of the light, her tired mind playing games. But it wasn't. The next night, the man was there again. This time, he was closer, his features still hidden in shadow. Nina backed away, fear clawing at her chest. She grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, but the moment the cloth touched the frame, the air in the room shifted. A low, groaning sound filled the air, as though the house itself was protesting. The lights flickered, and the blanket slipped off, landing in a heap on the floor. The mirror stood untouched, the man still visible in its depths. Nina didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the man came closer. She began to notice other things, small changes in the house that she couldn't explain. Doors that she was sure she'd closed were left ajar. The sound of faint footsteps echoed down the halls at night. Objects moved from their places when she wasn't looking. By the end of the week, the man's face was fully visible. It was pale and gaunt, his mouth stretched into a grin too wide to be human. His eyes were dark, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. She tried to get rid of the mirror. She called a local junk removal service, but when the workers arrived, they refused to touch it. "Something's not right about that thing," one of them muttered, backing away. Frustrated, Nina decided to move it herself. She grabbed a hammer, intending to smash the mirror to pieces. But as she swung, the reflection in the glass changed. It wasn't just the man anymore. The room in the mirror was different, dark and twisted, the walls dripping with some black, tar-like substance. The man stood in the center, surrounded by shadows that writhed and pulsed like living things. And there was something else. Her own reflection, trapped in the glass, pounding silently on the inside, her mouth open in a scream that Nina couldn't hear. The hammer fell from her hand. She ran from the house that night, leaving everything behind. She didn't care where she went, as long as it was far away. A week later, she received a call from her grandmother's lawyer. The house had been sold, and the new owner wanted to thank her for leaving the antique mirror behind. The lawyer's words chilled her to the bone. He says it's his favorite piece in the whole house. Nina hung up without replying. The last time she passed by the house, she couldn't help but glance at the window. The mirror was still there, like reflecting the empty room, and in it she saw herself, trapped, screaming silently, her face twisted in terror.
Story number 6.
Erin worked the night shift as a delivery driver for a local courier service. She didn't mind the odd hours. It meant fewer cars on the road, less traffic to navigate. Most of her deliveries were routine: offices, warehouses, the occasional private residence. But one night, everything changed. At 11:47 p.m., her dispatcher called in a last-minute delivery. "It's an express job," he said. "Address is out in the country, but it's paying triple. You're our best driver for it." She hesitated. The idea of driving out into the middle of nowhere this late unnerved her, but the extra pay was hard to pass up. She agreed, picked up the package, a small, plain cardboard box with no return address, and punched the destination into her GPS. The drive was long and uneventful at first. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by dark, winding roads flanked by dense woods. Her GPS signal wavered occasionally, but she pressed on, the eerie silence broken only by the hum of her van's engine. It was nearly 1 a.m. when she reached the location. The house was more of a crumbling shack, barely visible at the end of a dirt path overgrown with weeds. There were no lights, no signs of life. Erin double-checked the address. It matched. She got out of the van, the cold night air biting at her skin. As she approached the house, her boots crunching on gravel, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside, like the weak glow of a dying candle. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No response. She knocked on the door, louder this time. The door creaked open further, revealing an empty, shadow-filled interior. "Delivery for, She glanced at the label on the box. There was no name, only the address. Steeling herself, she stepped inside. The air was musty, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. The candle sat on a small table in the center of the room, its flame flickering weakly. There was no one there. Erin placed the box on the table, eager to leave. But as she turned to go, she heard it. A voice. Low and raspy, like the last breath of someone dying. "Stay." She froze, her heart pounding. The voice hadn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Slowly, she turned back toward the box. The candle's flame flared, casting grotesque shadows that writhed across the walls. The box trembled, rattling against the table. Erin took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. The lid of the box lifted slightly, as though something inside was trying to escape. And then she saw it. A hand. Thin and skeletal, its fingers unnaturally long, tipped with jagged nails. It pushed the lid open further, revealing a face that wasn't human. Its skin was stretched taut over a gaunt skull, right off its eyes deep black pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. "Stay," the thing rasped again, its mouth stretching into a grin that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. Erin didn't wait. She bolted out of the house, slamming into the side of her van as she scrambled to open the door. She could hear the thing behind her, its footsteps wet and uneven, its ragged breathing growing louder. She threw herself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out onto the dirt road. Her hands trembled on the wheel as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was gone. Not just out of sight, it was completely gone, replaced by an empty clearing. Her dispatcher called the next day, asking why she hadn't completed the delivery. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I left the package on the table. There's no record of a delivery to that address," he said. "And when we checked, that address doesn't exist." Erin quit the job that day, but sometimes, late at night, she hears it, the faint sound of a raspy voice whispering, "Stay," just outside her window.
Story number 7.
In a quiet town nestled between dark, ancient woods, there stood a peculiar shop. Its sign read, "Winston's Timepieces, Repairs and Restorations." The shop was small and unassuming, its windows cluttered with antique clocks of every shape and size. No one ever saw the owner, Mr. Winston, but the shop was always open, and the clocks always ticking. Claire, a college student home for the holidays, was walking past the shop one evening when a grandfather clock in the window caught her eye. It was magnificent. Ornate carvings adorned the wood, and its golden pendulum swung in hypnotic precision. As she leaned in to admire it, the shop door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of varnish and dust. The ticking of dozens of clocks filled the room, a disjointed symphony of time. "Hello?" Claire called, stepping inside. No answer. She approached the counter where a smaller clock sat, its hands frozen at midnight. Beside it was a note scrawled in spidery handwriting. "Take it. Fix it. Finish what I couldn't." Curiosity piqued. Claire picked up the small clock. It was surprisingly heavy, its brass casing cool to the touch. Before she could question what she was doing, the shop door slammed shut behind her. When she turned back, the store was gone. She was standing alone on the darkened street, the clock clutched in her hands. At home, Claire examined the clock more closely. The face was pristine, but the back panel was slightly ajar. Inside, she found gears tangled with thread-like strands that looked disturbingly organic. As she touched them, she felt a sharp prick, like a needle piercing her skin. She pulled her hand back, but it was too late. The clock's hands began to move, and that's when the dream started. Each night, Claire dreamed of a dim, endless workshop filled with clocks. They hung from every surface, ticking and talking in perfect unison. At the center of the room stood a man. He was tall and thin, his face hidden by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak, but his presence was suffocating. In every dream, she was forced to repair clocks, endless, intricate machines that grew more grotesque the longer she worked on them. Gears turned to bones, springs to veins, and the clocks began to bleed. She woke each morning drenched in sweat, her hands trembling. The small clock from the shop now sat on her nightstand, its hands always pointing to midnight, no matter how many times she reset it. By the third night, Claire began hearing the ticking even when she wasn't near the clock. It followed her everywhere, at school, in the library, even when she walked through the woods to clear her mind. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. Desperate, she decided to return to the shop. But when she arrived at its location, the building was nothing but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. Claire tried to smash the clock, but it wouldn't break. She hurled it against walls, struck it with a hammer, even tried to burn it, but the clock remained unscathed. Worse, every time she heard it, the dreams became more vivid, more horrifying. One night, the man in her dreams finally spoke. "Time is a circle," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and yours is running out." The next morning, Claire woke to find her reflection in the mirror wasn't her own. The face staring back was older, lined with wrinkles, her hair streaked with gray. Her hands, once young and steady, were now gnarled, her veins prominent under paper-thin skin. She screamed, clutching the clock. Its hands spun wildly, faster and faster, the ticking now deafening. "Fix it," the voice whispered in her mind, "or you will take my place." Realization dawned on her. The clock wasn't broken, it was cursed, and she was its next victim, trapped in an endless cycle of time and torment. Claire fled to the woods, desperate to escape the ticking that now echoed in her very bones. Deep in the forest, she found a clearing where time seemed to stand still. There she buried the clock, hoping to end the nightmare. But as she covered it with dirt, she heard a faint ticking beneath the ground. When she returned home, she found a note on her kitchen table, written in the same spidery handwriting as before. "You can't bury time. It always finds you." And then the ticking began again.